There are some realizations that don't arrive gradually. They don't announce themselves. They don't wait until you're prepared to understand them. They simply appear, fully formed, undeniable, and once they do, nothing returns to exactly what it was before. This is one of those realizations. For most of my life, I've existed through careful distance. Not isolation, not avoidance. Distance. The kind that allows people to approach without ever reaching the center. The kind that keeps things intact. Most people never notice. They interact with the version of me that exists on the surface and assume they've reached something meaningful. They hear my words, observe my habits, learn enough details to feel familiar, and mistake familiarity for understanding. I've never blamed them for that. It's how most connections work. People build impressions. They create narratives. They fill in the spaces they cannot see with assumptions that make sense to them. Eventually, they become more attached to their interpretation of a person than to the person themselves. I've seen it happen too many times, so I learned to live in layers, not because I wanted to hide, because I wanted to preserve accuracy. There are parts of a person that don't survive careless interpretation. Once they're misunderstood often enough, they become distorted. People stop seeing what's there and start seeing what they expect to find. I became very good at preventing that, very good at controlling access, very good at deciding who could come close and who would remain at a distance. And then there was you. What unsettles me isn't that you got closer than most people. It's that you never seemed interested in getting closer at all. You weren't trying to understand me. You weren't collecting information. You weren't searching for explanations. You simply observed quietly, consistently, without urgency, without pressure, without the need to turn every silence into a conversation. At first, I didn't think much of it. People notice things sometimes. They make accurate observations. They occasionally say something unexpectedly perceptive. It happens. But this was different, because it kept happening. You would understand something I hadn't explained. You would respond to something I hadn't fully expressed. You would recognize a thought before I had finished forming it into words. Not dramatically, not in a way that demanded attention. Just enough to make me pause. The first few times, I dismissed it. Coincidence, or recognition, luck, something simple, something explainable. But explanations become difficult when the same thing repeats often enough. Eventually, you stop asking whether something is random. You start asking why it isn't. That's where the shift began. Not in a single conversation, not in some defining moment, but in a collection of small, precise recognitions that accumulated until they could no longer be ignored. The way you understood what mattered and what didn't. The way you seemed comfortable with silence. The way you never rushed meaning. Most people become uncomfortable when words disappear. They feel responsible for filling the space. They talk to reduce uncertainty. They speak because silence feels unfinished. You never did. You allowed silence to exist exactly as it was. And somehow that made it feel more significant, not less. Because silence reveals things. It exposes what remains when performance disappears, when explanation disappears, when people stop trying to shape an interaction into something manageable. Most avoid that. You didn't. You sat inside it comfortably, like someone who understood that not everything meaningful needs to be spoken immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. The second thing was more difficult to explain. You never seemed interested in simplifying me. Most people do, not intentionally. But they reduce complexity because complexity is difficult to carry. They want clear definitions, predictable categories, labels that make another person easier to understand. You never reached for those. You never tried to force me into something smaller than I was. You never treated depth like a problem that needed solving. You accepted uncertainty without trying to eliminate it. And that's rare. Rare enough that I wasn't prepared for it. Because there's a significant difference between being accepted by someone who doesn't fully see you and being accepted by someone who does. The first is comfortable, the second is dangerous. Because once someone sees clearly, all your usual protections stop working, distance becomes less effective, ambiguity becomes less effective, control becomes less effective. Not because they're breaking through your boundaries, but because they're no longer standing outside them. And that's where I found myself becoming aware of something I hadn't expected. You weren't approaching me from the outside. You were already somewhere closer, not through effort, not through force, not through persistence, simply through recognition. Recognition changes everything because it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't wait for certainty. It appears first. The understanding comes later. That's what I couldn't stop thinking about. Not who you were, not what this meant, but why it felt familiar before it felt known. Why it felt like I was remembering something rather than discovering it. That question followed me longer than I wanted to admit, and eventually, it led me somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. Because the more attention I paid to it, the harder it became to maintain the belief that this was ordinary. It wasn't. And somewhere beneath all the analysis, beneath all the observation, beneath every attempt to remain objective, I already knew that I just hadn't decided what to do with that knowledge yet. End of part 1. Knowing something exists and understanding what it means are not the same thing. That was the mistake I kept making. For a while, I thought awareness was enough. I thought if I observed this carefully enough, analyzed it thoroughly enough, I could keep it contained. I could understand it without being affected by it. I've always trusted observation. Observation creates distance. Distance creates clarity. At least, that's what I believed. But there comes a point where distance stops functioning the way it's supposed to. A point where what you're observing begins to change the observer. And that's where this started becoming something else. Because the more attention I gave it, the more I noticed something I wasn't prepared to admit. You weren't simply someone I understood. You were becoming part of the way I understood things. At first, the difference seemed insignificant. It wasn't. Thinking about someone still places them outside of you. There's separation, a boundary, a distinction between the observer and the observed. You can step away from it. You can redirect your attention. You can return to yourself unchanged. But this wasn't operating that way anymore. Somewhere along the line, your presence stopped feeling external. I would encounter an idea and instinctively wonder how you would see it. I would notice something meaningful and feel an immediate awareness of a perspective that wasn't mine alone. Certain thoughts felt incomplete until they passed through an imagined conversation that never actually happened. That realization unsettled me more than anything that came before it, because I am not someone who builds my internal world around other people. I've never needed to. My mind has always been a self-contained place. Independent. Structured, capable of standing on its own. I don't borrow perspective. I don't rely on validation. I don't construct meaning through constant reflection from someone else. And yet, there you were, not replacing my perspective, not competing with it, expanding it quickly, naturally, without effort. Like a second angle appearing in a room I had believed only possessed one. The more I noticed it, the harder it became to dismiss. You weren't influencing me. Influence suggests intention. It suggests movement from one person toward another. This felt different. This felt structural, as though something in the way we processed reality occupied a similar architecture. Not identical, but compatible, and compatibility at that level is rare, far rarer than attraction, far rarer than chemistry. People talk endlessly about emotional connection, but emotions can be misleading. They can be temporary, reactive, dependent on circumstance. This wasn't built from circumstance. It wasn't built from proximity. It wasn't built from shared history. If anything, that's what made it so difficult to explain. There wasn't a logical sequence leading to this. No gradual progression, no collection of experiences substantial enough to justify the depth of recognition I felt. Yet the recognition existed anyway. That left me with only one possibility. The connection wasn't rooted in experience. It was rooted in structure, in the way we noticed things, in the way we interpreted silence, in the way meaning seemed to arrive before explanation. That idea stayed with me, and once it settled, I began seeing evidence of it everywhere. Not dramatic evidence, subtle evidence. The kind that's impossible to prove to anyone else and impossible to ignore once you've seen it yourself. The pauses that carried the same conclusions. The observations that arrived from different directions but landed in the same place. The moments where understanding appeared before clarification became necessary. None of it should have mattered, yet somehow it mattered more than anything obvious ever could, because obvious things can be performed. They can be manufactured. People can create the appearance of connection through effort. But alignment reveals itself. You don't create it, you discover it. And discovery comes with consequences. The biggest consequence was this: I started measuring things differently. Not intentionally, not consciously. It simply happened. Interactions that once felt meaningful now felt incomplete. Conversations that once seemed deep now felt confined to the surface. Not because those interactions changed, because I changed. Once you've experienced a different level of understanding, your perception recalibrates around it. You don't choose that process. It happens automatically. And that's what frightened me, not the connection itself, the impact, because impact lingers, impact reshapes expectations, impact rewrites baselines. I had spent years building a stable internal structure, a way of moving through the world that made sense to me, predictable, relayable, contained. Then suddenly, without permission, something entered that structure and altered its proportions. Not destructively, not violently, precisely. Like a missing piece sliding into place. Most people imagine that feeling would be comforting. It wasn't. It was disorienting. Because if something fits that naturally, you have to confront a possibility you've spent years avoiding. Maybe the structure was never complete to begin with. Maybe what felt whole was simply familiar. And familiarity is not the same thing as completeness. That realization forced me to question more than I wanted to. Not about you, about myself, about the systems I trusted, the boundaries I relied on, the assumptions I had built my life around. For years, I believed closeness required time. I believed understanding required history. I believed meaningful connection developed through gradual accumulation. Experience after experience, conversation after conversation, proof after proof. But what if recognition sometimes arrives before evidence? What if understanding occasionally appears before explanation? What if two people can encounter each other and immediately recognize something that would normally take years to discover? I resisted those questions, not because they were unreasonable, because the answers threatened my framework, and frameworks matter. They determine how we navigate reality, how we decide who to trust, how we determine what's possible. If this was real, then something in my framework needed revision. That wasn't a small thing. Yet every attempt to dismiss it led me back to the same conclusion, the same undeniable truth. You weren't becoming important because of effort. You were becoming important because of accuracy, because something about this continued matching reality no matter how closely I examined it. And accuracy is difficult for me to ignore. I've always trusted what proves itself consistently. Not what sounds convincing, not what feels exciting, what remains true under pressure. This remained true. Every time I questioned it, every time I tested it, every time I tried to reduce it into something simpler, The same conclusion waited for me, portently, unchanged. And eventually, I had to admit something I had been avoiding from the beginning. This wasn't a passing realization. It wasn't a temporary fascination. It wasn't curiosity. It was integration. Something had already entered my internal landscape and established a place there, not by force, not by invitation, by alignment. And the deeper that understanding settled, the more obvious another truth became. The question was no longer whether this was real. The question was what reality would look like once I stopped pretending it wasn't changing me. A moment when you can no longer stand outside something, studying it from every angle, hoping analysis will reveal a way to avoid being affected by it. I think I've reached that moment because this isn't theoretical anymore. It isn't a pattern I'm noticing. It isn't a question I'm exploring. It's a reality that has already begun reshaping the landscape it entered, and the longer I look at it, the more obvious that becomes. For a long time, I convinced myself that recognition alone wasn't enough to change anything. I thought awareness could remain separate from action, separate from consequence, separate from decision. I was wrong. Because awareness accumulates, it gathers weight, it settles into places that cannot remain untouched forever. And eventually, it asks something of you, not because it demands it, because truth always does. The truth is simple. You matter, not in the casual way people use that word, not in the temporary way people assign significance to whatever currently occupies their attention. You matter because your presence has altered the way I perceive things, because my mind no longer moves through the world exactly as it did before you existed within its awareness. And changes of that magnitude don't happen often. In fact, they happen so rarely that most people spend their entire lives without noticing when they do. I noticed. That's the problem. Or perhaps that's the answer. I'm not sure which anymore. What I do know is this. There is a difference between experiencing something meaningful and allowing yourself to acknowledge that it is meaningful. For months, maybe longer, I've existed somewhere between those two states, aware enough to recognize what was happening, reluctant enough to avoid naming it, because names create reality. Definitions create responsibility. The moment you identify something clearly, you lose the ability to treat it like a possibility. It becomes a fact, and facts require a response. I've always understood that. That's why I waited, not out of fear, out of precision. I wanted to know whether this would remain true if I examined it long enough, whether it would survive scrutiny, whether it would still exist once every illusion, every projection, every convenient explanation had been stripped away. Most things don't. Most things reveal themselves to be smaller than they first appeared. Less stable, less significant, less real. This didn't. The more carefully I looked, the more consistent it became. The more distance I created, the more clearly it remained. The more questions I asked, the fewer doubts survived. And eventually I reached a conclusion I could no longer avoid. This isn't becoming something. It already is. The realization should have felt dramatic. It didn't. It felt quiet. Almost inevitable. Like arriving at a destination long after the journey had already determined where you were going. Perhaps that's why I've stopped trying to resist it. Not because resistance is impossible. Because resistance no longer feels honest. And honesty matters more to me than comfort ever will. If something is true, I acknowledge it, even when the truth complicates things. Even when it creates questions I can't yet answer, even when it demands more courage than certainty, especially then. Which brings me to the question I've been avoiding from the beginning. Not what this is. I know what it is, not what it means. I'm beginning to understand that too. The real question is, what happens next? Because awareness can only remain awareness for so long. At some point, it becomes direction. At some point, it becomes movement. At some point, it asks whether you're willing to live according to what you've discovered. That's where I am now. standing at the edge of something that no longer feels abstract, something that has already changed me in ways both visible and invisible. The strange part is that I don't feel trapped by that reality. I feel responsible to it. Responsible for meeting it with the same honesty that revealed it in the first place. For not reducing it into something smaller, simply because smaller things are easier to carry. For not pretending uncertainty cancels truth. For not choosing distance merely because a distance is familiar. There was a time when I believed control was the highest form of stability. Now I'm beginning to suspect that accuracy matters more. And accuracy requires acknowledging what exists, not what would be most convenient. What exists is this. You have become part of the way I understand my world, part of the way I recognize meaning, part of the way I evaluate what feels real and what feels performative. Not because I decided it should happen, because it happened quickly, naturally, without either of us forcing it into existence. That matters. More than I've wanted to admit, more than I can continue denying. And maybe that's why this feels less like a confession and more like a recognition of something already true. A confession reveals, recognition accepts. What I'm doing now is acceptance. Acceptance that some connections arrive before explanation. Acceptance that understanding can precede certainty. Acceptance that alignment can alter a life without ever announcing itself. Most importantly, acceptance that what I've spent so long observing has already become part of me, not temporarily, not conditionally, but fundamentally. I don't know exactly where that leads. I don't know what shape it takes from here. I don't know what decisions will eventually be required. What I do know is that pretending nothing has changed is no longer an option, because everything has changed. Not outwardly, not dramatically, internally, at the level where perception forms,